All right, so today we are diving deep into a region that, well, it often feels like it's balancing on a geopolitical tightrope. The Horn of Africa. We got a pretty fascinating mix of sources for this one. News articles, some analyses, and the works, all kind of pointing to this, well, a perfect storm, you could say. We're talking regional alliances, some internal struggles within Ethiopia, and, well, really eyebrow-raising election to the UN Human Rights Council.
Yeah, and what's really captivating here is how all of these they seem like separate issues, right? But they're really like threads in the same tapestry. You've got all this stuff going on, old rivalries that never seem to fade, power grabs, the international community just trying to figure out its role in all of this, and it's all playing out on this, well, this stage where the stakes, they couldn't be higher.
It's totally giving high-stakes political thriller vibes. Okay, so before we get ahead of ourselves, I think it would be good to, like, paint a picture of the players involved for our listener. Basically, you've got Egypt, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, all tangled up in this web of strained relationships. Think back to high school, you know. But instead of who's dating who, it's about like who has access to vital resources and control over strategically important territory.
And then right smack dab in the middle of all of this is Ethiopia. They're dealing with like grappling with these internal conflicts in the Amhara and Oromia regions. And these aren't just like, you know, minor disagreements or anything. We're talking about full-on armed groups like the Fano militias, and they're directly challenging the government's authority.
And if that wasn't enough on their plate, there's also the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. Our listeners might remember them from the civil war in Tigray that thankfully ended a couple of years ago with a peace agreement. But here's where it gets really interesting. The TPLF, well, it's kind of on the verge of imploding.
Yeah. So it's not just, you know, dealing with the aftermath of a war with the Ethiopian government. They're also battling each other. And to really get how wild this is, you have to understand the TPLF is split into these different factions, right? And each of these factions, they have their own ideas about like the direction of the group and the interim government. And it's gotten so intense that one faction is actually trying to use like legal means to kick the other out. It really makes you wonder about like the whole concept of a lasting peace, doesn't it?
Right. Like signing a peace agreement is one thing, but actually achieving genuine reconciliation and stability, that's a whole different ballgame. And all of this internal turmoil in Ethiopia, well, it directly impacts how they interact with their neighbors. And of course, it impacts their track record on human rights, which is a whole other can of worms.
Which brings us to that head scratcher we mentioned earlier, the UN Human Rights Council election. So basically, the UNHRC is supposed to be the main voice for upholding and protecting human rights all around the world. So you would think that, well, that the countries elected to this council, they would have a pretty good track record on human rights, right?
Yeah, seems pretty logical, except
both Qatar and Ethiopia, two countries that are facing some very serious accusations of human rights abuses. Well, they were both elected to the council.
Yeah, the irony is definitely not lost on us.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about Qatar's treatment of migrant workers, which has been under like intense scrutiny, especially in the lead up to the 2022 World Cup. And then there are the concerns, the well-documented concerns about their stance on, well, LGBTQ plus rights.
Oh, and we definitely can't forget about the allegations of terror financing, something that's really dogged Qatar for years.
Right. And then you've got Ethiopia. We're talking about accusations of atrocities committed in Tigray during the recent conflict. And then there's the ongoing violence against civilians in the Oromia region. And just this government that seems, well, determined to silence anyone who dares to criticize them.
Yeah, and it's not like these are just random, baseless accusations. We're talking about organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, and even the UN's own High Commissioner for Human Rights. They've all documented like credible evidence of these abuses. So how did these two countries end up on the UN Human Rights Council? Well, the election process itself has been a bit of a point of contention for a while now.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like the kind of system where, well, political maneuvering and backroom deals, they often overshadow a genuine commitment to human rights.
That's one way to put it. Basically, countries often end up voting for their allies, regardless of their human rights records. It's kind of like a popularity contest where, you know, your friends are going to vote for you no matter what. And this has led a lot of experts, especially those at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, to argue that this type of election process, it really undermines the credibility of the UNHRC.
I mean, if the very body that is tasked with upholding human rights is seen as like a club for the morally flexible, does it even stand a chance of effectively addressing human rights abuses? It seems I don't know, kind of counterproductive.
It's definitely a valid concern, and it raises an even bigger question. What's the point of even having a human rights council if its members aren't even held to the standards they're supposed to be upholding?
Right. Like, what message does that send to the world? But I do have to ask, is there another way to look at this? Maybe a sliver of a silver lining?
Well, some argue that having countries like Qatar and Ethiopia on the council with all eyes on them might actually be an opportunity for progress.
Okay, now you got my attention. How so?
Well, the thinking is that being in the international spotlight might actually push these countries to be more open to dialogue about their human rights records. It might also give other member states a little more leverage to pressure them to make some real reforms.
It's like this high-stakes game of diplomatic poker, but instead of chips, we're talking about the fundamental rights and freedoms of real people.
And those people are caught in the crossfire of all of these complex geopolitical maneuvers. And while the diplomats are busy debating, millions of people in the Horn of Africa are facing violence, displacement, and these human rights abuses every single day.
It's definitely a heavy reality check.
Yeah.
But let's zoom back in on the regional dynamics that are at play here for a second. So we talked about Ethiopia's internal struggles, but then there's also this really fascinating triangle that seems to be forming with Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia. So what's the story there?
Yeah. It's honestly like a geopolitical soap opera, and all the drama, it all centers around Ethiopia. So Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia, they all have their own, well, you could say they have their own bone to pick with Ethiopia, and they seem to be finding strength in numbers.
Ooh, I do love a good alliance story. Spill the tea. Where do these tensions stem from?
Okay, so let's start with Egypt and Ethiopia. They've been locked in this really heated battle over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GRD, for over a decade now. Egypt, they rely very heavily on the Nile River for their water supply, and they're worried that the GRD is going to significantly reduce the amount of water that flows downstream to them.
Well, yeah, water is essential. I can understand their concerns. So Egypt's a little on edge with Ethiopia, to say the least. What about Somalia? What's their beef?
Somalia and Ethiopia. It's mainly a territorial dispute, and it basically revolves around Somaliland. Now, Somaliland declared independence from Somalia years ago and has been trying to get, vying for international recognition ever since. Ethiopia saw this as an opportunity and basically struck a deal with Somaliland, offering to recognize their independence in exchange for something pretty big, a lease on a chunk of their coastline.
Okay, clever move on Ethiopia's part. Landlocked countries, they always need access to the sea.
Exactly. And Ethiopia, they want to build a naval base there, which, strategically makes a lot of sense, right? But Somalia, they were furious. They see Somaliland as part of their territory, so Ethiopia's move was like a direct challenge to their sovereignty.
So Ethiopia's out there playing chess, and Somalia is feeling like a pawn. Ouch.
And just when you think the drama can't get any juicier, Egypt enters the chat. They basically seize the opportunity to further their own interests in the region.
Oh, this is getting good. Tell me more.
So Egypt has been providing, military aid to Somalia. They even offered to deploy peacekeepers there. And remember earlier when we talked about Egypt facing its own economic crisis?
Yeah, I was actually just about to ask about that. It's like they're dealing with all this economic turmoil at home, yet they're pouring resources into projecting power in the Horn of Africa. Doesn't really seem like the best move financially.
Right. You would think it's this apparent contradiction that really highlights just how strategically important this region is for Egypt. It's so important that they're basically willing to prioritize geopolitical gains, even when they're in the middle of their own internal struggles.
Wow. Talk about playing the long game. Okay, so to recap, we've got Ethiopia, who's caught in the middle of this power struggle, grappling with internal conflicts, facing all this criticism for their human rights record, and now they're dealing with this new regional alliance that seems to be forming against them. And we haven't even talked about Eritrea's role in all of this.
That's right. We can't forget about Eritrea. They've got a really, really long and complicated history with Ethiopia, marked by this really brutal border war back in the late 1990s.
Right. It seems like everyone in this region has some old grudge or some simmering tension with each other.
Exactly. Yeah. Historical baggage plays a huge role here. And just to add another layer of complexity, Eritrea actually supported Ethiopia during the recent conflict in the Tigray region.
Wait, so they were allies in one conflict, but enemies in another. My head's spinning.
Welcome to the Horn of Africa. Alliances here are almost never black and white. It's all about navigating this complex web of interests and these constantly shifting power dynamics. And with Eritrea now involved, things just got even more unpredictable.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, it's a lot to process.
Yeah.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We've definitely got a lot more to unpack here. But before we dive into the implications of all of this, I'm kind of curious, what stood out to you so far?
Honestly, it is, well, it's a lot like you said. It's like a geopolitical soap opera, but the stakes are just so incredibly high. Like, it's hard to wrap my head around how these countries navigate all these, like, deep-rooted rivalries, all this suspicion, while also dealing with all these internal problems. And then, on top of it all, they're trying to function on the world stage.
It's a very delicate balancing act. And the potential for things to really spiral out of control, that's a very real concern.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big what if. Like, what are the potential consequences of all of this? Not just for the Horn of Africa, but also for, like, the international community's efforts to actually promote human rights.
Well, let's start with the regional implications. We've got this rivalry, right? This rivalry it's brewing between Ethiopia and this new Egypt, Eritrea, Somalia bloc. Could this escalate into a full-blown regional conflict?
That's honestly what I'm most worried about. It feels like just one wrong move could set off, like a chain reaction.
It's not just a feeling. The whole situation is so volatile right now. There's been a pretty noticeable increase in military activity. Egypt's sending all these weapons to Somalia. There are reports of troop movements in the region. And then there's Eritrea, which, well, they've got a history of military interventions, and they aren't exactly known for their peaceful approach to foreign policy. So Eritrea's involvement just adds this whole other layer of unpredictability to an already tense situation.
It's like they're trying to put out a fire, but at the same time, somebody keeps, like, pouring gasoline on it. And we can't forget about those internal conflicts in Ethiopia.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. The situations in the Amhara and Oromia regions, they're still really tense. You've got armed groups like the Fano militias, and they're actively challenging the government. And then there are all these reports of mass arrests, human rights abuses by Ethiopian security forces. And then, of course, you have the TPLF, which is, they're grappling with their own internal power struggles.
Right, like that saying, united we stand, divided we fall. But in this case, the fall could have some really, really devastating consequences, not just for Ethiopia, but for the entire region.
Exactly. The internal problems within the TPLF are especially concerning because it makes you question their ability to actually uphold their end of the peace agreement, the one that ended the civil war in Tigray. If that peace falls apart, neighboring countries could easily get dragged in and turn a local conflict into a full-on regional war.
So it really is a house of cards. One wrong move and the whole thing could just collapse. Is there anything that can be done to prevent this?
Honestly, I think the key here is diplomacy. There needs to be a real concerted effort from the international community to step in and help. Regional actors, like maybe the African Union, they need to really step up their efforts to, mediate between these different groups. They need to encourage dialogue, find some kind of common ground, and help these countries find a way out of this mess.
That's going to be tough, though, right? I mean, these countries have a long history of mistrust, animosity towards each other.
It won't be easy, that's for sure. But that's exactly why diplomacy is so important right now. It's about finding common ground, however small it might seem at first, and then building on it. It's about shifting the focus away from these zero-sum games of power and towards a future where cooperation and mutual benefit define how the region interacts. It's a long and difficult process, but the alternative is, it's unthinkable.
I really hope they're listening. But speaking of complex situations, let's address the elephant in the room. This whole thing with countries that have, questionable human rights records being elected to the UN Human Rights Council. It's a bit of a head scratcher. What are the implications of this, not just for the Horn of Africa, but for the credibility of the UNHRC?
It's a question it's been around for years. Critics of the UNHRC argue, and I think rightfully so, that electing countries like Qatar and Ethiopia really undermines its legitimacy, its effectiveness. I mean, it sends a pretty dangerous message to the world that the international community is basically willing to overlook human rights abuses when it's politically convenient.
It's like saying one thing but doing another. Makes the whole idea of Human Rights Council seem, pointless.
That's the danger. It creates this two-tiered system where some countries are held to a different standard than others.
A slippery slope for sure. But you mentioned earlier that there might be like a glimmer of hope in all of this. How so?
Well, some people argue that having Qatar and Ethiopia on the council, like right now, with all eyes on them, it could actually be a really unique opportunity for engagement, for potential reform.
Okay, I'm listening.
So the thinking is, by being on the council under the watchful eye of, well, of everyone, these countries might be a little more open to scrutiny, more receptive to pressure to, actually improve their human rights records.
So it's a gamble, but the payoff could be huge.
Exactly. The international community can use this opportunity to hold these countries accountable for their commitments, push for real, tangible reforms, and ensure that their actions actually match their words, and not just, on paper, but in practice.
It's a high stakes game, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But what can our listeners do? How can they make a difference in a region that it feels so far away? I think it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this. Like anything we do is as just like the one person is just a drop in the ocean. But I don't know. I've always kind of believed that even small actions, they can create these ripple effects, things that extend way beyond what we can even imagine.
I totally agree with that. And I think the most important tool that every single person has is their voice.
So what can our listeners do, from their living room that can actually make a difference thousands of miles away in the Horn of Africa?
Well, I always say the first step is to stay informed, right? Read articles from, good sources, follow organizations that are working on the ground, and don't be afraid to talk about these issues, even if they're tough. The more people that understand the complexities of what's happening in the Horn of Africa, the better equipped we'll all be to demand better from our leaders and, and to hold those in power accountable.
Knowledge is power, for sure. But how do we actually go beyond just knowing about these problems to contributing to solutions?
That's where supporting the organizations that are working on the ground every single day becomes so important. There are so many incredible NGOs, these humanitarian groups that are doing such vital work in the Horn of Africa, providing aid, fighting for human rights, and working so hard to build peace in a region that is often just defined by conflict.
Do you have any specific examples? I'm sure our listeners would love to know how they can directly support these efforts.
Absolutely. So Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are always great places to start. They do some amazing research, advocacy work all over the world, but the Horn of Africa is a big focus for them. And then there are also organizations like the International Rescue Committee and Doctors Without Borders, which provide essential humanitarian aid to those impacted by violence and displacement.
So we're talking donating, volunteering our time, or even just spreading the word about the work that they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Every little bit counts. And honestly, never underestimate how powerful your voice can be. Contact your elected officials, write to newspapers, use social media. These are all ways to bring awareness to these important issues and push for policies that actually promote peace, protect human rights in the Horn of Africa.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless. Even when faced with these big global challenges, we can all do something, play a role, no matter how small it might seem, in creating a better world.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, that's what these deep dives are all about.
100%. It's about equipping you, our listeners, with the knowledge and the context you need to really engage with the world around you, to ask those critical questions, and to become active participants in building a better future.
Yes, and it's not just about passively listening or reading, right? It's about taking that information and then using it to make informed decisions and take action.
Exactly. So as we start to wrap up our deep dive into the Horn of Africa today, we want to leave you with this. We've explored these really complex relationships, the human rights concerns, the potential for both, conflict and cooperation. But it's so important to remember that the Horn of Africa is more than just a collection of headlines, It's more than just a stage for these big geopolitical power plays.
It's a region that's rich in history, in culture, and it's home to millions and millions of people who deserve our attention, our support.
Exactly. So as you learn more about the Horn of Africa, don't just stop at the headlines. Seek out the stories of the region, the voices of its people, engage with its history and its cultures, your understanding of these really complicated issues, and honestly, your ability to contribute to real solutions, well, it will only grow from that.
That's a great point. And perfect note to end on. This has been quite the deep dive, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to stay curious, stay informed, and definitely stay engaged.
I'm right there with you, and I think our listeners are too. Until next time, everyone, keep asking those important questions.